So we are here in studio at the University of the Pacific at the Stockton campus. We took a little bit of break, but it is after Thanksgiving. We're fast approaching the holiday. We're in the holiday season,
Right.
right? And I have the distinct pleasure of being in studio with Professor K Pontuti, a professor of MediaX, the director of MediaX here at the University of the Pacific, a non-binary filmmaker, and an artist that has been engaged in a multitude of formats of making art. And so this particular conversation is really an opportunity for myself to get to know Kay deeper, but also I think for Kay to be able to talk a little bit about themselves in a ways, that we can see it expressed through your art form, but for you to tell us about your art form, and also to hear a little bit more about who you are. Now, Kay, you go by they, them pronouns.
Yes.
Yes. And tell us, how long have you been a professor here at the University of the Pacific?
So this is halfway through my 6th year now.
Yes.
And so 5.5.
Yeah.
And yeah, I love it here and
Mhm.
love the mix of teaching, administrative
Mhm.
work, and all the other fun stuff we get to do.
Yeah. So, how long have you been the director of MediaX? And for the people who may not know what MediaX is, tell them what MediaX is,
Yeah,
the
so
department.
so MediaX is a bachelor's of arts degree. It's a
Uh-huh.
4-year degree,
Mhm.
and it's a program
Mhm.
that mixes storytelling, media, art,
Mhm.
technology
Mhm.
into this really exciting kind of new form of being and operating within this kind of rapidly evolving media landscape. So it's
Yeah.
super interdisciplinary. It spans departments, it spans the
Yeah.
university, and it's
So
awesome.
so we have MediaX majors actually here in the studio right now. Our production assistant, you can't see her, but we can see her,
They're
is
amazing.
is also in the MediaX department. But what are types of jobs or careers or
Mhm.
things that people that are your MediaX students, what will they become? We know that filmmakers. I know there's
Mhm.
filmmakers in your department. What else is
Right.
there?
I mean, there's all sorts of
Yeah.
transdisciplinary storytelling. So
Yes.
things like social media,
Yes.
animation, game related,
Yes.
immersive design. I think one of the most exciting fields right now that we're looking at
Mhm.
is how museums and education is happening in such a more multifaceted,
Yeah.
interdisciplinary way. And so, like, I look at like what we've been able to do here around like
Mhm.
some of our exhibitions, even on campus,
Yeah.
where we're doing things that are a mix of film and video and
Yes.
interactivity and immersion and
Mhm.
seeing how these stories come to life in just so many
Mhm.
different ways and
Mhm.
mediums.
So you're in the business of storytelling,
Mm,
fundamentally. I
yeah,
think that
I
everything you
guess so.
do,
Yeah,
I
I
think
think we
that
all are.
I think we all are in the
Yeah.
business of storytelling, but in many ways, think you're very explicitly in that, and I think people would not deny that your work is all about telling stories. So, Kay, it would be really lovely for us to hear a little bit more about, your creative process, and maybe what are some of the
Mm,
early experiences that you've had that led you to your work,
mm,
um, um, and maybe begin, if you will, early adolescent,
mm.
maybe even 20s, but some early experiences, that led you to the path that you're currently on.
Yeah. Well,
Uh-huh.
from the most simplest, I would, when I was a little kid, I definitely was really into drawing
Hmm.
and um, other sorts of art making
Yeah.
activities, and
Hmm.
that's something that goes back all the way to
Uh-huh.
as far as I can remember,
Yeah.
and then and continued through adolescence and high school even,
Uh-huh.
although it kind of veered in different
Uh-huh.
ways. But then, like, when it came time to go to college,
Mhm.
I was kind of in a different kind of headspace and had kind of forgotten about,
Mhm.
not forgotten, but I hadn't really looked at it as like a career possibility.
Yeah.
And so when I started it, undergrad, I went in not really having a major, not knowing what I
Uh-huh.
wanted to do. And it wasn't until my like junior year that
Uh-huh.
I went international study abroad to Ireland and to
Wow.
London.
Yeah.
And when I was in London, I went to some museums and some art galleries, and I
Mhm.
was like, oh my gosh, like this is amazing. Like, and
Absolutely.
so I came back from Europe and took a couple art classes, and then changed my major to art at the beginning of my senior year.
I love that. So, and here's the thing, because that decision is something that I think at the undergraduate level, a lot of students may not know that they can do that,
Mhm.
who are equally as gifted as well as motivated, but yet
Mm,
they make decisions about their majors based upon what they think the marketplace is
right.
demanding of them,
Yep.
right? And so you were fortunate enough before you finished your undergraduate degree to actually pivot. And then
Hmm.
you actually got a bachelor's of fine arts in art
Hmm.
at Slippery Rock University in Pennsylvania.
Right.
So, and the reason why I say that because, Kay, I worked in what I call higher education in art and design for a number of
Hmm.
years. I was at Otis College of Art and
Right.
Design in Los Angeles, at that campus there. And when you work in an art college, that is probably the most immersive place for undergraduate, master's level students to be their full selves as far as because
Hmm.
they're immersed in the art world. I didn't realize what a privilege it was to be able to have that type of support. And then what happens when you're able to do that? And so now, as I've gone back into an institution such as, the one that both of us are part of, how do you kind of create those opportunities for students that actually might be misplaced?
Mm,
But they need to either be in your department or they need to be able to have transdisciplinary or
hmm.
interdisciplinary experiences where perhaps they're a health sciences person or they're in another area, but they need to be able to take classes that
Right.
allows that creative expression that opens all kinds of employment pathways. Am I
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It's really quite
Yeah.
phenomenal the employment pathways that having a bachelor's of fine arts can create for students.
And we're seeing, I mean, so much more of that now. Like
Mm-hmm.
the things that we're hearing that employers want, and
Uh-huh.
all different fields is,
Yeah.
people with humanities experience, people with international experience, people with empathy, people with
Mm-hmm.
the ability to connect with other people.
Yeah.
And I mean, art, film, media, design, are all very user centric, or
Yes.
it's all about
Mm-hmm.
like a user experience, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I think the arts are just set people up so well in so many
Mm-hmm.
ways that maybe
Mm-hmm.
aren't initially recognized. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I got really lucky. I was very
Mm-hmm.
lucky to be able to do that. I was also in a pretty small
Mm-hmm.
liberal arts university in
Yes.
Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
and definitely not like a big art program, but it
Mm-hmm.
was it was kind of like the size I needed, and
Yeah.
that was really to be able to get that kind of real connection with my faculty members
Mm-hmm.
was something that I mean transformed me, and was just such
Mm-hmm.
an amazing opportunity. And it's
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I think about here, and in a similar way, where these kinds of connections we're able to have with our students is just kind of really powerful. And I hope that I can be kind of part of some of that, to give back in a way. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's one of the things that's always driven me, as I think about like why I'm in education, and,
Mm-hmm.
and, and why I do this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that sort of giving back. And I feel like I can never do enough of that. So,
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think you're giving back not only with the work that you do, but how we show up in spaces. I do think that one of the things that you do as a professor is that you show up wholly, you show up in your full self. That's one
hmm.
of the things that I've always admired in the time that we've known each other is that it's a very affirming presence that you have. And in your own affirmation, you affirm other people's identities. One of the things that I did actually recently, within the last few months, was that I actually had an actual name change.
Mm,
And I changed my name. I
mhm,
returned to I chose to go back to my father's name. It
mhm,
was, I had very other current undercurrents and reasons why I wanted to do that, but it had been a process that I had been thinking about over a number of years, so it didn't
mhm,
happen overnight. And this idea of identity and names are so important. Are they
mhm.
not? The names that people put upon us, the names that we take,
Yeah.
assume. Sometimes there's alignment, but other times there may or may not be alignment. And so often we're trying to align to be our truest self. You also went through a process,
Mhm,
and I think that affirmation, even as a colleague of yours, just seeing that from a distance, and then when you sent out a notice to your friends and colleagues,
mhm,
to let us know, it was very affirming,
mm.
and I'm telling you that as an equity leader, it's like how important it is
Oh,
for you to affirm yourself, that it affirms other people too. Tell us a
no.
little bit about that process for you.
Well, so where do I start?
Mhm, mhm,
Yeah, so within, all within the last year,
mhm,
I, came out, really, through the whole realization, the whole
mhm,
part of this amazing experience is
mhm,
that, within the last year, um, I figured a whole bunch of stuff out,
mhm,
and that had been, percolating for many years,
mhm,
and came out as queer, non-binary, trans. I
mhm,
changed the name I go by, my
mhm,
pronouns,
mhm,
my wardrobe,
mhm, mhm,
and did it, and did it both on the personal side and the
mhm.
scale with myself, my friends, my
Uh-huh.
family, but then also professionally,
Mhm,
and all in a fairly like rapid. um, I think one of the things that kind of happened
mhm.
is once I started, it seemed like kind of hard to not kind of just jump in the whole way and go the whole way with it. And so
Yes, yeah.
there was definitely some discussions,
Mhm,
that I was having and trying to figure out around like, well,
mhm,
how do you
mhm,
even do this? Like
mhm,
I'm so new to this and so new, and I don't come from a gender studies background. I don't,
mhm,
like,
mhm,
so I'm learning it. I was
mhm,
learning so much as I went, and but then there was this whole thing around like, well, I'm also kind of a campus leader and a
mhm,
professor, and I've got
mhm.
students. It's mid-semester, and
Uh-huh.
how do I talk about this?
Yeah.
And so I did a kind of a crash course
Mhm,
in that,
mhm,
and then yeah, then kind of made the decision that like, okay, just to I
mhm,
think to simplify things and make
mhm.
it less confusing to everyone and myself
Yeah.
probably. I went kind of public with it,
Mhm,
and it was
mhm,
amazing, and it was just so affirming, and
mhm,
just I just it's kind of it blows my mind every day. Like it really does. And I think back like, oh
mhm,
my God, it's not even been like a year.
mhm.
And it's just been incredible.
So that's a testimony. That in my cultural background, basically you spoke the truth, and you spoke your truth. And there's power in that.
Hmm.
Am I right about that?
Yeah.
You can feel.
Yeah.
I can feel it. You can
Yeah,
feel.
no,
You can sense
it's
it.
wild. It's a really, I mean, it's hard to put words to.
Yeah.
It really is.
And so this idea of being one's truest self, oftentimes, people will say, what is diversity, equity, and inclusion work about? I said, well, it's at the core, it's liberation work.
Mm,
It's about helping us as a society to help others be their truest and highest forms of themselves, and we do that by creating spaces of liberation, but what holds back liberation is when people are suppressed or they've been
mhm,
oppressed systemically. Sometimes it comes in the form of discrimination. It comes in the
Mm-hmm.
form of unequal and unfair treatment. Sometimes it's historically based, so we do take these efforts,
Mm-hmm.
in schools and employment and in work. And sometimes we have legislation that turns to policy, but what we're trying to do, we're trying to, liberate, people in the way that they need to be liberated. And then in the process, sometimes we have to reconcile,
Mm-hmm.
and that reconciliation work sometimes is hard,
Yeah.
particularly if, we've done things that maybe we didn't know about were not the best things, and we have to reconcile our relationships with certain people or certain groups.
Mm.
Um, so this idea of like liberation and reconciliation are things I hear when you talk about, how good this past year has been, or the process that you've gone
Mm-hmm.
through in your own transition. What thoughts that you have around liberation and reconciliation, even as an artist,
Mm-hmm.
because you're an artist. Um, these ideas of, I think, because I think about liberation and I think about freedom and I think about
Mm-hmm.
reconciliation, as actually very essential in equity work.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but those are common themes when you think about stories. People
Yeah.
are always looking for freedom. People are
Mm-hmm.
trying to be their truest and highest selves.
Mm-hmm.
You know, um, there's always these ideas of liberation. That's the reason why
Yeah.
people are, inspired to do things.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have these stories around reconciling. We have to reconcile with relationships that have been broken or what have you.
Yeah.
Any thoughts you have around those things?
Again, so many.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think one, I think back to, things I've had to reconcile with are things like, religion, things with,
Mhm.
friends and
Mhm.
family members, and, and kind of going through that kind of process
Mhm.
of, like figuring out, like where some of this had been even repressed in me. And
Mhm.
I will say, like, I come from a very privileged position
Mhm.
in being able to kind of stand up for this. And, I'm in a very, kind of protected position at the university.
Mhm.
I'm very aware of the, the benefits that I've had. And,
Mhm.
so, yeah, with all that said,
Mhm.
there's so much around, thinking about like kind of where I came from, the path that I went,
Mhm.
why it took me this long to find myself here.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, so there's been probably like each of those things that I've I've
Mhm.
mentioned, there's been a whole series of, reconciliations and, just
Mhm.
assessments, really.
Mhm.
I think starting with assessment, and,
Yes.
that's really, in some cases, I'm still in that assessment mode, to be
Mhm.
honest. Like, and I think and I think, as an artist, I'm always in that mode. So these
Mhm.
things kind of intertwine and
Mhm.
overlap and are, for
Mhm.
me at least, very often hard to kind of like unpack or
Yeah.
untangle would
Yeah.
be the thing is, there's, I operate kind of like, in a self-aware, entanglement, which I
Mhm.
think is one of the things that's so amazing about the creative process is, for me, how these tangles become their own kind of webs of storytelling and,
Yes.
and putting things together
Mhm.
and then retelling them and retangling them, in some cases. So,
Yes.
yeah,
I love that oh, it's almost like this weaving process.
yeah, yeah.
And it depends on how you weave it, and you have a new story or new reiteration of that story.
Yeah, yeah. No, and
Mhm.
I think with, and obviously I work in both film, drawing, painting, sculpture,
Mhm.
animation, just,
Love it.
like all different kinds of
Mhm.
mediums,
Mhm.
and seeing them get tangled together in ways that are,
Mhm.
is really kind of fun, and,
Yeah.
and doing different kinds of projects and stuff like that. But, yeah, I think that there's, relationships, are evolving,
Mhm.
because of, where I'm at now compared to where I was a year ago.
Mhm.
There's been a lot of, I've felt very, very supported, both here at the university
Mhm.
and through my family and my
Mhm.
friend group. And I've
Mhm.
just, It's, it's been a roller coaster, but when I'm very sincere when I say that it's been amazing.
That's
And
wonderful.
it's never perfect,
Of course.
but yeah, like it's awesome, and it just continues to be that, or hope so.
Mm-hmm. So, pray and be thankful for everything.
Mm.
I found that exhibition, which I'm not even sure, is it still up?
No.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I was able to be there for the opening of it.
Yeah.
And you were able to, have your students and your colleagues with professors and some friends, and even saw some people from the community that were out that day to join in and celebrate with you the opening of this exhibition that had been here at the Reynolds Gallery on the Stockton campus of the University of the Pacific. And that particular exhibition was my first time that I saw your work. Large scale pieces. Was there any video in that one? No, but it
No.
was, and it had been work that you had been consistently working on since 1993. Am I right? Is that were there pieces that went back that
There were
far?
definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
Consistently very broad.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was definitely work from the 1990s. Most of this work in the show came out of my kind of drawing practice.
Yes.
This sort of daily drawing practice
Yes.
that I've kind of come in and out of over the
Yeah.
years, and more recently really rekindled. But yeah, some of those works went back, way back.
Yes, yes. Now tell me about, and I think that the audience will be really interested in hearing your creative process on the title that you chose for the show.
Right.
It resonated with me, because first of all, this idea, pray and be thankful for everything, that in the early formation of my own childhood, that's the kind of sentiment that, I would have heard in the home,
Right.
so
Yeah.
you pray, yes, I will, and be thankful for what you have. Yes, yes, so
Right.
so I found that to be personally, I found that to be the title of your show. It was illuminating, and I'm not sure what it was illuminating to, but because I don't want to put anything in my from my life and my process into yours, and so share with me a little bit of what you were thinking about that title.
So yeah, so the title, it actually came from one of the drawings.
Okay.
There is a drawing in the show that has that, and it's juxtaposed with this kind of rocket ship flying up into space. And it's this kind of, it was one of those things when I was going through, because I use a lot of text in my drawing work, and I think some of that comes out of like my early interest in comics and that sort of, so I was digging through and kind of thinking about like what the title could be, and when I landed on that, pray and be thankful for everything, thinking about the last year and the last few years where there's part of me does authentically feel that way, and then part of me at the same time is like, I have a pretty complicated with my relationship with my Catholic upbringing, and so there's still a lot of like anger there, and a lot of things where I'm like, okay, well, with I'm still kind of working on those things, and they're evolving, but like, so there's part of me that like believes that, and then there's other part of me that's looking at it from a different perspective where it's like, okay, F you, like, this is not like, you're telling me this, or people are, it's like, well, no, I'm not thankful, and I'm not, thankful for everything, especially what's going on right now in the world. And it's like, you want me to be thankful, pray, where, these are, some of the same people that are pushing anti-trans agendas, racial agenda. I mean, just, like some pretty like
harmful.
Yeah. And so the dichotomy there of, like, and I think, and this is the thing even within myself, it's like, I believe this, but I also know this, right? And so it seemed like a really great juxtaposition.
Yes.
That could kind of walk that line with the work in the show, and with kind of where I was personally too.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a little like add-on, So True Bestie,
Mm-hmm.
which is another way of, starting to kind of like point, I hope, towards there was the little text that was on the poster,
Mm-hmm.
pointing that, don't take this at face value.
Yes.
And so that is something I was hoping that would come through,
Yeah.
also.
Mm-hmm. And very powerful words you use when you said this idea of belief, and kind of the classic definition of what is faith. Faith
Mm-hmm.
is believing in the things that you hope for, but it's not seen. So this
Mm-hmm.
idea that you're hoping for something even though you don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what faith and belief is.
Right.
But at the same time you have this thing with knowledge. You said when you belief with knowledge. And so
Mm-hmm.
what do you do when you have knowledge that that there's contradictions? Not only are there contradictions, whether it's in text or whether it is in dogma, whether it is in beliefs, but the contradictions actually are harmful, and you have evidence to prove that it is.
Right.
And so this idea on this kind of this moral spectrum that you can hold both, and I think that's what you're trying to do, even in that title. That I think was really interesting too. This idea that we can believe and we have knowledge, and it's not an either or; it's a both and.
Right. Right. No, and I'm glad that you see that, and and hopefully that was part of your initial reading, and I think the show was just such an amazing thing. Both for me, it was the first time. Well, the first time that most of that work's ever been shown, including the older work. Like that's this is something that I'd kind of kept boxed away and hadn't really made public. Done a little bit of that, and but really to kind of be able to kind of use the work and practice as a way to kind of also tell my story and get that out there, and help kind of learn it for myself too at the same time, because it was all kind of part of that process of kind of like uncovering things and creating new things, and pretty lucky.
Yeah, we both are lucky.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the films that you've done. Okay, so we're going to transition from the this most recent exhibition, the one that we're just talking about, Pray and Be Thankful for Everything, that just basically closed. It would have closed just
about a month ago.
A month ago.
Yeah.
To some of the work that was released when I first came to Pacific, and that's how I first came to know you, was the yellow wallpaper.
Right.
Okay, so I had come home to Pacific, hadn't been here in a number of years, and Professor Pontuti, and there was this advertising that I had saw that there was a screening of it, but it was during the pandemic, and it might have, and so I was trying to figure out how to see it, but it was also online,
right?
But as I did more research, it's called The Yellow Wallpaper, was a 2021 horror film based on the Charlotte Perkins Gilman iconic feminist short story.
Correct.
Got that right? Okay. Yeah. And it premiered at the Carey International Film Festival, the Topanga Film Festival, that's down in SoCal, right? And the the Two Horror Film Festival. And at the Topanga, it won the Best Narrative Feature. So tell me about that method of your creative process, and talk a little bit about that film.
Yeah. So
and congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. No, it's amazing. It's it's still going. These film projects never end. It seems like, in a great way. So we have a couple festivals coming up over the next few weeks.
Oh, wonderful.
So we're still doing the festival circuit. But yeah, that was so. The Yellow Wallpaper is a feature film. It's something that my my wife and I really kind of honestly, it was her idea. Like she was very passionate about this story. I know she'll tell the story. It was like one of her first real kind of connections to feminist literature, and so she convinced me pretty easily, that this should, we should make this into a movie, and I, I mean, it was kind of a funny story, because she's like, you've got to read the yellow wallpaper. And I was like, I read that back in college. Like, yeah, and she's like, basically sent me into my office and said, don't come out until you read it. It's 20
Wow.
pages, don't come out.
Uh-huh.
And I literally came out of my office. I was like, oh my God. She's like, what? I'm like, we got to make this into
Uh-huh.
and it was one of those things where she could see, I mean, it was just so relevant. Still, and it was just something that I could like I just immediately seeing images and thinking about how this, it's such a visual story.
Yes.
And so we started the process almost 5 years ago now.
Okay.
And we filmed it in Ireland, basically the summer before the pandemic.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, we got very lucky there, and that we did that, and then we through the pandemic we were doing the post and the editing and worked with some Pacific related people on the film, which is awesome, and and then we finished during the pandemic, and our initial festival release was during the pandemic.
Yes.
I keep saying during the pandemic, but
yeah, I know.
But it did. It was
during
like
the heart of the pandemic, and that's when I first got introduced to you.
Yeah,
and was through this piece of work.
And that was really hard. Like finishing this during the a pandemic,
yes.
and we had to learn how to do things. My composer, who's a Pacific retired, Robert Coburn, who was in the conservatory for years. He was doing the music up in Oregon. My sound designer is in Wisconsin. And so like we had to figure out how to do these things that we would normally do together in a room. We had to do it remotely.
Wow.
And so it slowed the process down. It made it harder to kind of have that communal, like, collaborative experience around it. And that was really hard because that's something I really, enjoy and value. And then it, we did initial festival tour was virtual festivals. And then we started doing some in-person ones, like the TO Horror Festival in Turin. That was one I wish I could have gone to because they did an in-person screening there.
Oh, they did.
But it was just we couldn't travel yet, and so same thing. Carey was an in-person festival, or they did both. They did hybrid and in-person, but we couldn't travel, and so we, I mean, that was a little bittersweet around having to, not be able to see it in theaters with an audience. Right away. I finally got to do that recently at the Duluth, Minnesota. And so I went to that just this fall even. It was honestly the first time.
You saw it in the audience?
Yeah.
Oh my
like in a
goodness.
real theater from the DCP with the Dolby 5.1 sound and the beautiful color I'd worked on for like a year.
Wow.
And that was like amazing, and something that it just kind of it hit me though that I had not seen it in that realm, which is really how we designed it.
Yeah, and
so it's so designed for that, and I've never been able to do it, and so I'm really grateful to the people of Duluth, and for we had some of my short films had played at their festival before over the years, and gotten to know them, and so. When they invited us to the festival this year, it was just really like, oh my God, it was just like a little homecoming, and just a great experience.
So just so that the audience knows some of the other works that you have, these are other short films. The Yosemite Welcome was actually right before you started the shooting of the Yellow Wallpaper in 2019.
Right.
So this one was 2018, the Yosemite Welcome. And the Veneto was 2017, and then Pescare was 2016, and then you also did Honore, also in 2016, and then before that, North Passage was in 2014. Tell us about any one of those films.
I would say that so I got into filmmaking kind of later.
Okay.
Like, we talked a little bit about, I have a studio art background and worked professionally in LA and all over the place in, different capacities, using those sort of studio art skills and digital skills I developed.
You were also in San Francisco.
In San Francisco. And so, I kind of got into filmmaking later. I kind of
Uh-huh.
decided that, you know, this was the medium I wanted to explore,
Uh-huh.
and started, you know, and North Passage was my first.
Mhm.
And it was the typical micro budget
Mhm.
indie production starring my daughter,
Mhm.
starring, you know, I mean, just, you know,
Mhm.
made with a great community in Wisconsin.
Mhm.
Of, you know, it was amazing.
Yeah.
You know, it was one of those films that started off as a short film
Mhm.
and turned into a featurette, like on
Love
its
it.
own.
Mhm.
And that was a really powerful experience, you know, to be able to work with a community like that.
Mhm.
And it was also something that gave me kind of confidence of like, oh, I can do this,
Mhm.
right? Like
Mhm.
I could, you know, like I did that. And
Mhm.
so I had the confidence, like I can make this kind of work, and I can, you know, I had producing experience, even though I didn't call it producing. You know, it was
Mhm.
project management
Yeah.
experience, and I, you know, had a vision, and worked well with people, I guess, enough to
Mhm.
get them to keep coming back.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that was pretty incredible.
Mhm.
And then, you know, I made 3 short films,
Mhm.
Pescari, Onere, and Vanita,
Mhm.
all within like a couple of
Yeah.
years. And they're like 3 little vignettes that kind of all relate to each other.
Mhm.
And that was also with my wife
Mhm.
Alexandra. We
Yes.
weren't married at the time, but
Mhm.
we started our collaboration through those,
Mhm.
which then, you know, kind of formed and
Mhm.
coalesced into a much bigger, you know, kind of
Yes.
personal and,
Mhm.
you know, professional relationship,
That's
creative
beautiful.
relationship.
It's a
Yeah,
creative relationship that continues to blossom.
totally. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
amazing.
So talk to us. This podcast, is called Humanizing Us,
Mm.
and people say, "Well, what is humanizing us?" I said, "Well, it's an opportunity for us to do some highlight some narratives, some stories of people that I like,
Yeah.
my friends, but it also is an opportunity for to talk about their stories as in the intersections of these various parts of who we are. Um, how much of your story is woven into any of those movies that you just talked about in different kinds of ways?
Yeah, yeah. When I think, I mean, more I think about
Mhm.
it, like, I mean, those 3 short films,
Mhm.
especially,
Mhm.
and I'd say pretty much into everything. So much of
Mhm.
my work really becomes autobiographical in its own way.
Mhm.
Just that process of
Mhm.
taking things in and
Yes.
internalizing them and
Yes.
putting them back out there.
In whatever format you
Yeah,
choose.
and it's I don't know if I could do it any other way, you know, without doing that, right?
Mhm.
Like, I know some people are able to do it, but for
Mhm.
me, it's just they're so intertwined,
Yeah.
and
Because it's not an object. It's actually a living thing.
yeah, yeah. Well, and then, you know, and then it goes out in the world,
Yeah.
and but with Onere, Pescari, and Vanita,
Mhm.
those all kind of, you know, explore things around my kind of Catholic upbringing.
Mhm.
Like there's a lot in there.
Yes.
One of them was filmed in Italy,
Okay.
which speaks to some of my heritage,
Uh-huh.
and baggage,
Uh-huh.
and
Mhm.
you know, and so yeah, like all 3 of those really get really heavy into
Mhm.
self-acceptance,
Mhm.
body image,
Mhm.
all, and I bear
Religion,
what's
a
that?
little bit of religion.
Oh, a
Yeah,
lot of religion,
early
and
formation.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
yeah,
This
and
is great.
so,
Mhm.
um, you know, there all 3 are, you know,
Mhm.
really kind of heavy in religion,
Mhm. Mhm.
and you know, they are kind of horror shorts,
Yeah.
but they're
Uh-huh.
very, I think, also very beautiful and contradictory,
Mhm.
and there's no jump scares.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's much more kind of, I think, thoughtful,
Mhm.
um, like horrificness
Mhm.
than they are like you know, what you would look at
Yeah.
as like a horror
Yeah.
art, you know, art film horror.
Yeah, it's an art film. Yeah, it's not about the horror. It's about the experience
Hmm.
that has a cognitive piece.
Yeah, yeah. And these are all 3 of them are very simple and slow and
Mhm.
meditative, and so they really kind of
Mm.
open up this kind of opportunity to kind of like think about what's going on
Mm-hmm.
screen, but then also connect it to, yeah, I mean, really, kind of, they're almost like paintings. I mean, they really come out of my kind of painting background, so I
Yeah.
think of them as very painting-like.
Yeah. I
Um,
love that
yeah,
analogy.
yeah, and so even some of the imagery,
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of mining from art history
Mm-hmm.
and some of the kind of paintings that I've become obsessed with over the years, and
Mm-hmm.
and think about, like, it's like I've got this, on one hand, this religion that I have
Mm-hmm.
all sorts of problems with,
Mm-hmm.
and then this artwork that was created, out of that religion,
Mm-hmm.
in support of
I
that
love,
religion,
yeah,
and
yeah.
was, in a lot of cases was, advertising, or, and that's saying it at its best.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of, yeah, and it's like, how do you rectify
Mm-hmm.
these, this beautiful artwork that's being made about,
Mm-hmm.
like, some really terrible things,
Mm-hmm.
and what sort of,
Mm-hmm.
um, and how is this storytelling being used as propaganda,
Mm-hmm.
but, like, and how do you unweave all that,
Mm-hmm.
and in a way that, like, I still look at these paintings and go, like, oh my gosh, like, these things are, the people who made those, like, and a lot of them were also working, I mean, this wasn't the topic that they were, wanted to be making paintings about.
Absolutely.
This
They
was driven by market,
by
driven
market.
by,
Yeah.
the people
Uh-huh.
who were paying them,
Absolutely.
or worse. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I mean, I think that there's, yeah, it's one of those really kind of complicated problems
Mm-hmm.
that, we talk about in the humanities, and
Yeah.
how to, like, look at these from, multiple perspectives.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, so I think in a way, all three of those short films were really, pivotal, and really do, um, actually deal with some of the same topics that are in the drawings and stuff that, were in the show,
Mm-hmm.
which was something I hadn't really initially quite put together. I was like, oh my
Yeah.
God, they're so different, and it's like, well, they are and they aren't.
They are. And the
They're all,
common denominator is that you are the creator.
yeah, yeah, and similar themes in a lot of cases,
Mm-hmm.
just a different way of presenting,
Absolutely.
very different way of presenting. So,
And I guess that you're going to continue to find new insights
mm,
on how these works are
yeah,
connected to one another.
absolutely. I mean, it's even as we're talking, I'm going,
Yes,
like,
absolutely.
these connections. I'm going, like, oh yeah, I didn't think of, and that's what I love about,
Mm-hmm.
talking about,
Mm-hmm.
this with
Mm-hmm.
people, especially with people like you, who are
Mm-hmm.
just brilliant. And
Mm-hmm. So students love you. I know that because they say so.
some of them, no,
Yeah. um,
most of them, I hope.
yeah, I think they
I
appreciate
really, but I
the
appreciate it.
the way you show up, as I said before, and very affirming. So, humanizing us. You create art through your own experiences, through the various methods, and you're a professor as well, and you're directing a program, helping other people do this process for themselves under the construct of a university environment, so
Hmm.
they can get a degree, an actual degree that they could go using them out in the marketplace, and hopefully use that degree to make the world a better place,
Right.
right? um, when you think about where you're at in the role of the professor, the role of the program director, and the role of the artist, the creator, you
Hmm.
know um, how do you use all that um, as a way to kind of what I would say, uh, make more humanizing spaces for everyone, because you're
Hmm.
in a very particular and I think a very honored role in society to be a teacher, a
Hmm.
mentor, and a creator.
Hmm.
It's really wonderful kind of a combination that you have. You know, how do you see your role in kind of creating more humanizing spaces for us?
I think that it's something that, I mean, starts with, just day to day, and,
Mhm.
and being there for people, and both in and out of the classroom, in our lovely studios, and and I think a lot of it starts with, like, getting people there, getting people into the conversations that may not necessarily get there on their own, or find want to go there right away, or I mean, obviously there's people that that are definitely showing up, but there's also, I think we have students here that are also looking for their place, and and so providing resources for them in terms of friends and mentorships and activities, and kind of creating a vibrant space, I think, is like one thing to kind of start with. And but then I've been looking a lot at with my artwork in terms of thinking about, because when I make films, it's super collaborative, and there's lots of people involved, and there's it's a very lots of interaction. When I'm doing my drawings and working on my other work, which I love for its kind of more solo driven, time by myself, kind of that side of it, that's something that I really value. And but I'm trying to now figure out, like, different ways of, like, mixing them. And I don't know if it's like collaborative drawing work or creating spaces around, like, kind of public art projects, and stuff like that. So, like, trying to look for ways, and there's just some, I mean, there's some great Bay Area institutions like Yerba Buena Center for the Arts that really do amazing work around kind of like art and social justice, and really looking at a very different kind of practice than, like, a traditional, like, gallery or museum practice, and showing that kind of work and supporting these other kinds of kind of creative projects that are very community driven. And yeah, so I kind of looking for new ways to keep new for me in a lot of cases. So it's something that I'm but I think new for a lot of people too. And when we think about the role of the artist now, I think it's we're looking at it always, it's always evolving. And yeah, just trying to kind of figure out, like, what are the different possibilities moving forward, because I'm also at kind of like a juncture. There's a lot that's whether I'm going to make another film, which I plan to, or continue. I've got another show coming up, and and all of this, and thinking about, like, trying to find time to reflect. I think it's another thing that even you had mentioned. This need for this. Taking the time to kind of reflect and let things process, which is something that that there's with everything we're doing, and especially getting towards the end of a semester, it's there's just stuff flying around, and I on a daily basis, I'm like, okay, I need to just reflect and catch up.
Absolutely.
And when you're doing multiple kinds of multiple projects, and so as I'm doing these things with myself, I'm also thinking about, like, well, what's this mean for my students or my colleagues, and trying to find better ways to support them, and make sure that they've got both the energy, but the time to reflect, and we're making sure that that's part of the process too.
We need spaces of what I call interior. We have to create spaces to have interior processing, just to be, to understand what it is that we've already done, so we know what we want to do next. So you took me towards, as we come towards the close of our time together here, was that the next projects is thinking about more community conscious and even more community driven artwork that has a justice lens, and has a could perhaps be more equity advancing, and justice in its orientation. And generally speaking, that art does not reside in institutions such as the beautiful institution that we're members and part of, that brought us together, the University of the Pacific. It doesn't mean that those institutions don't have a part in it, but
Mhm.
that type of artwork oftentimes belongs to the community.
Mhm.
And so to try to find that type of work or ways to do that will be really exciting
Yeah.
to kind of see this next evolution.
Mhm.
Um, your work is already incredible, and because you're an involving person, and because of your career, I think we're going to continue to see more really great things come from you, and I can't wait to see what comes next.
I I'm excited to see what comes next too.
Yeah.
Like I said, this has been the movie came out this year,
Hmm.
show came out
Show
this
came out this
year,
year.
I came out this year.
You came out this year, and we couldn't have
I
scripted
mean,
that better.
wow. I mean, it's just, and
It's a,
I just, and thank you
hmm
for having me on today and all of your support
hmm
over the last year and
hmm
multiple years. But like,
hmm
you're such an amazing resource
hmm
for faculty, students, everyone here. And
hmm
I can't wait to keep watching our, friendship flourish. And yeah,
Yeah. So K Pontuti, they, them, in our studio today. Professor Pontuti, thank you so much for taking the time. And we're just going to continue to follow you and see what happens next.
thank you so much.
Thank you. Today's episode of Humanizing Us was recorded at the University of the Pacific Stockton campus. For more episodes, check out the University of the Pacific's Scholarly Commons digital repository, the Humanizing Us YouTube channel, or Spotify and other podcasting apps. The Humanizing Us podcast is hosted and created by me, Dr. Mary J. Lomax-Ghirarduzzi, and produced by Niraj Chaudhary, Dean of the William Knox Holt Memorial Library and Learning Center. The team who put together today's show include Chris Crawford, Media and Production Engineer, Carina, Carey, Media and Production Assistant, Namorrah Ward, Research and Editorial Associate, and Maytag Yang, Executive Assistant to the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Original music was produced and created by Dr. Paul Subar, Professor of Oral Health and Dentistry at the University of the Pacific's Dugoni School of Dentistry. Please subscribe to the podcast and let us know what you think. Thank you for joining us, and don't forget, DEI is how we institutionalize love. DEI work is humanitarian work.